I'm Layman Pascal, or perhaps a set of Layman Pascals, and this is the Integral Stages author series. Today we're sitting down with integral multiplicity expert, co-author of Your Symphony of Selves, and the answer to the question, what do you call someone who grooves? It's Jordan Gruber. Hey, Jordan.
Hey, Layman, how are you today?
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Why don't we first tell people how they can get their hands on this book?
Yes, you can just go to yoursymphonyofselves.com. That's SELVES. And you'll find a way to read an excerpt or go to Amazon. You can go to Amazon itself. You could search for Fadiman and Gruber and Symphony. It's got a pretty distinctive cover that you can spot among a lot of other covers. And it's available in audiobook and in Kindle and in paperback. The paperback, you get to see the cartoons, and there's about 10 cartoons in the book that we had to pay a pretty penny for. So you should get the paperback because it's a great deal.
Terrific. The title I like. Concept of symphony made me think of a thing in my own experience years ago. I had a friend, and she had a sort of a booklet of personality diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
She was torn between which of two mental illnesses she might have.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to take a look. So I flipped through and I found I identified with almost every set of described symptoms in the booklet.
Right.
And I felt pretty healthy. And so I started to wonder whether or not sanity was something like a symphony of mental illnesses, was how I phrased it to myself at the time. Like I had these module selves, and when one of them stood out too much, then it looked like a neurosis. But if they all fit into place, then that's who I was. And so I'm curious about the reaching for the metaphors of music, of orchestration and symphony to describe the more ideal relationship between selves and modules of selves.
So the first thing I'd say is that what you were probably experiencing was different selves in their worst aspects, in the worst parts of different selves. So you could pull out and magnify the neurotic or worst behavior and say, yes, I've got this one too, and I've got this one too. The metaphor, we have a list of about 70 metaphors in the book. Symphony and jazz bands are really good, but also things like teams or a braided rope. And there's just so many different ways of thinking about it. And that's not really surprising, because if this is really the way things are, and psychology has been off for 110 years, as we say it has been in America at least, then you would expect this to be everywhere. And so in our book, we bring out this idea of healthy multiplicity, not pathological multiplicity, because this is being informed by a transpersonal perspective. And keep in mind that my co-author and the person who initiated this project is James Fadiman, one of the founders of transpersonal psychology. So we always have a positive view of looking at this. We're not necessarily trying to do therapeutic interventions, although there's a lot of those. We're trying to say ordinary people that we know, healthy people, are they just one person, or do they have more than one self? And, this all started when Jim started looking a long time ago at himself and other people he knew. And it was like, why are people inconsistent? Why do you say you're going to, not eat that cookie, and then you 1 minute later eat that cookie? And so for us, the simplest Occam's razor compliant answer is that you actually do have different selves or subpersonalities or parts. We actually have a list of 50 or 70 different things that people have called it, and it's not important. What's important for us is that these, we talk about them in terms of self states. So, and we follow in Paul Verdern and Charles Tart's language. And we say something like a self state is a recurrent pattern of mind, body, chemistry, perception, intention, and behavior. It's a little bit different, but that's basically it. So on the whole, people seem to come in and out of these different centers of gravity. Some of the charts where you're looking at how system science works and how things collapse into different basins of attractions are a helpful way of understanding this. And once you realize that you have these different selves, you know that you can more readily and easily shift into different ones. And so we like to say that mental health is being in the right mind at the right time. But the really big bonus is that you are more compassionate towards yourself and your self system and towards the people in your life. So that when someone forgets something that you told them, a partner, a wife, somebody important, and it's like they're literally not in the same part of who they are, and they don't have 100% access to all the other memories. So what we've done is just looked at philosophy, psychology, religion, language, neuroscience, Buddhism, postmodernism, and it all, for us, it fits in. And when you go, yeah, it's not a big deal. It's not spooky. It's just, William James, before things got pushed underground, he talked about social selves. People have as many different social selves as they hang out in different places and do different things with different people. So the obvious example is when I'm with my daughter and her friends or her friends' parents, I'm not the same person I am when I'm hanging out with my friends from college and we're partying. I'm actually in a different part of me. So when you take those parts seriously and realize that they have innate value, that they have their own agendas and even often their own entelechies, with the entelechy of an acorn to become an oak. And you can't just get rid of them. In the 70s and 80s when they tried to fuse them and all that, that went horribly wrong. So you have these different parts of who you are, and you can learn to work with and coordinate and love with them and identify them, or you can pretend they don't exist or try to bury them or chain them away. And then, eventually they come up. So that's what the book is about.
Terrific. Any book where the introduction mentions both Gurdjieff and Nietzsche has me. I'm sold.
Yeah, well, I'm fans of both. Although, we had a bit of I had a bit of a cognitive breakthrough earlier this week, which was after listening to Jim, my partner, Jim Fadiman, who's very well known in the world of psychedelics and microdosing, literally a legend. But this book isn't about that. But after listening to Jim talk with Sam Harris in an interview, where Sam was working out like, yeah, but it feels a little weird. And then he suggested that there is a different axis, an orthogonal axis was the word he used. So on the one hand, we have presented a different sort of way of thinking of self. So on the far left, although I'm not sure where you're seeing on my screen, you have somebody who has a pathologically incohesive self system. Their selves are not coherent. They get in all kinds of trouble. They might have fugues. They do things they don't remember. That's not so good. In the middle, we have what we're calling assumed identity. Most people assume they're one self, and they kind of work things out and make that happy. And over here, we have someone who is fully conscious that they have a set of selves, a constellation of selves. So do all the people in their life. And they learn how to shift into the right mind at the right time. And there's all sorts of benefits on this, from performance to creativity, all sorts of things. So that's the horizontal axis, increasing cohesion. And we want to replace dissociation with cohesion generally when we rewrite psychology from the ground up. But at the same time, you have a vertical axis. And on the top of it is people who want one self. They want a super self. Whether it's Gurdjieff, who says you're not real till you forge that single self, or whether it's people who are into monotheism, or whether it's some of the therapeutic systems like IFS that literally define the self as what you're in contact with when you're feeling better. Here's the one selfers. And on the bottom of that vertical axis, we have the zero selfers, Buddhism or Taoism, where you're trying to get rid of a little selves and big self. There is no self. And what we're saying is that this horizontal axis is a different question than whether you're going to have the single self and merge with it or be informed by it or worship it or become it, or whether you've completely dissolved selves through your meditation and your practice. And both of those sorts of people will benefit from having their ordinary horizontal level, regular world selves that they go to bed with and wake up with and either exercise with, and they're kind to other people. Those are the ones you have to integrate. So on the one hand, while the higher poles can pull you forward, they can also end up being a kind of spiritual bypassing. You're thinking that, all I have to do is be in contact and find my high self, my authentic self, my true self, and I'll be fine. It's like that can be a classic definition of spiritual bypassing. And the same for people who are just trying to dissolve it, but their lives aren't together because they haven't worked with their horizontal set of selves. So the wonderful thing about this is it shows very clearly that we're not in conflict with anybody who has a system where a single unitary self, in some sense, including, I guess, Hindus, although they're complex because they have multiple gods and yet a single everything. So that's not in conflict. Generally speaking, anybody who has more cohesion and is aware of their selves and has learned to integrate them and play them as a better symphony, when the oboe needs to go, the oboe needs to go. But until that time, you don't need the oboe. So it's kind of, that's sort of what we're saying. So I'm excited about this breakthrough. I've written it up in a chart, and Jim and I are we've been asked to put a chapter in a Cambridge University anthology, and I'm going to work that in there.
How do you think about different, I want to say, scales or legitimacies of selves? Because you could have a very broad lens where any passing mode or, a person walks from one room to another and forgets something. Are they a whole new person, or are they a version of one of their selves, right? Is it more appropriate to say, like, I have a lot of cells in my body, but I have a lot fewer organs.
Right.
And those organs can be in different modes of activity. So when is a subself, so to speak, doing different things at different times? And when do we consider those activities to also be selves?
So some people, especially neuroscientists, they've been for many years now, and we quote quite a few of them, talking about like little minds, little programs that wheel in and out, when you need them. And Sam Harris was similarly talking about like a whole set of different capacities that come online and offline. So that, I would suppose, would be one way of looking at it. The other way would be to go back to our definition and look for the recurrent patterns. So if you find that you're always going to the refrigerator and you're always forgetting something, you've got something where you're probably moving between two different cells, and it's not just a little, neurological brain fart. But the other, I think, even more important point is that one of the things I've learned from Jim is a reluctance to label things. So when I first took this idea to my men's group and I gave them index cards and say, everybody like write all your different selves out. And that might be like, I've got a coin collecting self and I've got a Frisbee playing self. And, and the more sort of rope I gave them, the more index cards, it was like they had so many. And it's like, So, but in the real world, it's like what happens is you'll have that moment. My wife will say something, and I use her as an example in this, and I really shouldn't. But my wife will say something or do something that we've talked about, I thought we agreed about, and I have a choice of either moving into like the snarky, unhappy part of who I am, or the kind, it doesn't matter, 95% of my suffering is on me when I react to stuff. Which of me am I going to go to now? So it's sort of more those fork in the road, cross-point decisions where it really comes up. Now, that's not to say that I don't also have a writer self, right? I've written, 20 full books and encyclopedia articles on all sorts of things. And that guy, he needs to be fed, he needs coffee, he needs to be exercised. He doesn't need to have a bong hit, but he thinks he does. That guy, I have to get that writer when I have real stuff to do in the seat. And so knowing that that's like a real set of patterns and behaviors and intentions and perceptions makes me go, oh, that's really him. And the other thing that came to my mind when you asked that question is there's this report from Dan Goleman in the New York Times of somebody who had dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, which is sort of the negative, pathological, incohesive cell system. It's a guy, and he's in a mental home, but he has 8 or 10 different distinct personalities. And in only one of them, who is Timmy, who is 11 years old, he can drink orange juice and he's just absolutely fine. But if they move him into another self, or if he drinks orange juice in another self, he gets terrible hives over his whole body. But as soon as they move him back into Timmy, the hives go away. So we don't focus too much on this kind of stuff because it gets people weirded out and it's garish and it's spooky, but we do have a bunch of resources of people moving into different cells where they're in different, the brain scans show that they seem to be in different cells. So, there are ways that people do seem, I do think that the system's complexity metaphor is appropriate, and that you do constellate into a main set of, everybody's different, and we only really have data on the pathological selves, but most people seem to have 5 to 12 selves. But some of them are younger selves. They can be, when people talk about inner children, our point is, you actually have a self that is younger. It's not just a metaphor, and it drives me crazy in Clubhouse because I go in all these rooms and people are talking about true selves, authentic selves, high selves. And it's like, what we think is that once you see this level of clarity, once you get the title just from the concept from the book's title or the first chapter, you can experiment for yourself. And we're getting a lot of reports, including friends of Jim who are his peers and famous teachers who are going, I knew about this, but when I really step back and look at the big picture, I'm seeing stuff with the people in my life, my partners, and I'm making changes. So, other people have said this about their books many times, but this isn't a self-help book, but it is a psychoactive book. It will potentially change you greatly once you see sort of the overwhelming evidence for the fact that psychology has been wrong-headed for 110 years now.
Why has psychology been wrong-headed? What is the reluctance in people to think in terms of ourselves as pluralities?
Well, there's a lot of things. On the one hand, you have monotheism framing all of us, right? So one God, one soul, one self, that's it. Get to the back of the line. You also have Western philosophy, which in a lot of its core has what's called essentialism. So, Socrates and Aristotle, they were all over something being its own unique essence. So there's that background. And then previously, in centuries past, people who had selves that were too different were thought to be possessed, or especially in the Christian religion and in other religions too, native religions and shamanism. They had a better way for dealing with that and working people together. In fact, the Hmong people, for example, think that unless all of your different souls are in your body and working together, then you're just not going to be happy. So fast forward that all to the end of the 19th century, the late 1800s, and a couple of towering figures arise. One is William James in America, the father of American psychology. Another is W.H. Myers. And another is Jean-Martin Charcot, the great Charcot, the greatest neurologist in Europe, who revived the La Salpêtrière, I don't know how to say that exactly, hospital, and started working with women particularly who, then they were calling it hysterical, but people who had these different syndromes. And then Charcot had, his great disciple was Pierre Genet, who actually came up with the word dissociation. At the same time, Sigmund Freud, who is the bad guy in this story, Sigmund Freud also studied with Charcot in Paris. He named his first child Jean-Martin Freud. So obviously he felt strongly about Charcot. And in his first paper ever, which was The Story of Anna O, published with Breuer, he thanks Alfred Binet, who invented one of the inventors of the IQ test, and the two Genets, Pierre Genet and his uncle Paul, the philosopher, for their work in multiple selves, very explicitly in Freud's first paper ever. So Freud understood this and was working with this and was publishing about this. But later on, an event happened, which is called the rejection of the seduction hypothesis by Freud. Up until then, Freud, at the highest levels of Vienna psychoanalysis, people were coming to him and telling him these horrible stories of sexual improprieties and abuse and things with children and maids, like all the stuff that you can imagine was going on. At a certain point, Freud said, no, none of that is happening. You're making all of this up. And in that moment, he got rid of hypnosis and he got rid of selves, and it went underground. So in 1906 at Harvard, Pierre Genet is the headliner in a big conference on multiple selves. I think James attends, and some of James' premier students like Boris Sidis attend, and Morton Prince. 1906. By 1910, psychoanalysis had swamped the world. And Boris Sidis challenged Freud, particularly on this point, and ended up dying in, as they say, obscurity and penury. So challenging Freud was the wrong thing. And so the next time you really see anything about selves is The Three Faces of Eve, which was a movie and a book. And then you had Sybil. And, then there's a fantastic book called The Minds of Billy Milligan, written by Daniel Keyes, who wrote Flowers for Algernon, which is an extensive psychiatric and medical and police record of this guy who had 22 different personalities. So, he was definitely not well and spent all of his life in prison. But in one of his selves, he had super strength because he had read a book on adrenaline and could pull toilets out of the wall. Another one of his cells, even though he had never studied it, never went to school, was fluent in Serbo-Croatian. Another one of his cells was a really high-level portrait painter. So even when he was in mental prison, people would come to have Billy Milligan paint his portrait. So what's useful about that book is that even though it's pathology, we're willing to go to school on pathology, but the way he talks about the different cells that are in charge and let other cells into the light, into the spotlight, onto the stage, fronting, whatever you want to call it, it's a really unbelievably well-written and interesting book. It all just kind of went dark until the 70s, late 60s, when a certain number of therapists began realizing, when working with people, that it seemed that trauma had split off another self. And that became an idea that instead of people who had different selves that were pathological, instead of them being crazy, this was a positive evolutionary development. So when they were being abused, when they were 3 or 6 or 10 or whenever it was, they created another mind so that they could survive. And so they sort of picked up the ball and started moving things forward. And then you had there had always been certain therapeutic, we talked about Gurdjieff briefly, he knew about selves. Sri Aurobindo and the mother knew about selves. Psychosynthesis knew about selves, voice dialogue, and then Gestalt picked it up. but it's always still in this sort of negative framework that if you talk to yourself, you have more than one personality, and that's wrong. But here's, maybe a system that can help heal people. So, the next big move, I think, really is when Jim Fadiman starts realizing that there's an assumption that we are or ought to be a single self, and that's which we now call the single self assumption. And we think that it's inaccurate. It's not true of ourselves or anyone we know. And that when you start examining it and looking behind the single self assumption and start assuming a multiple selves worldview, so much gets explained and so much works better because you're now in sync with the way reality is. So, that's sort of our mission, is to pull back a level, even from people like IFS that are a therapeutic modality for working with parts. We're taking it back and going, the reason why parts work is so successful in coaching, the reason why, and I can get back to this, when an Alcoholics Anonymous says, my name is Jordan Gruber and I'm an alcoholic, and that's so effective compared to most psychotherapy because they've brought the alcoholic part of them into the room to be witnessed and healed and held. I mean, you just see this in so many places. And so, I think that's the reason. Freud kind of said it was wrong and no, and he had this other tripartite theory, but of course, it's not at all what we're talking about, because the id ego and superego had vastly different vertical levels of being than the kind of ordinary day-to-day selves that you live in, your athlete guy and your napper and your partier and your scholar and your parent, and all those selves, they're not about id ego or superego. So we think he basically made that all up so that he didn't have to deal with the fact that there were actually a lot of bad things happening in Vienna, and we've been on this sort of suppressed track where it's mainly been pushed underground since 1910 or so.
What's the relationship between say a healthy pantheon of selves and this idea of trauma-induced fragmentation of a self? Are they fundamentally different? Is the fragmentation not really real?
No, I think it is real. I think the fragmented self.
What's normal plurality versus potentially pathological plurality?
Okay, so here's a very important point. The fact that someone has multiple selves does not make them mentally ill. In fact, most of us have multiple selves, and the healthier you are, the more cohesive your system, the more beautiful the symphony you play, the healthier, happy, and more effective you're going to be. That doesn't mean you don't have one or more selves that need serious help for different reasons. So you might have a part of you that really is the main borderline part, or, we don't like, Jim is very allergic to labels, so we don't normally go here and we don't want to get too sucked in. But, I have one or two parts of me that are very afraid. One of them is still very afraid of death. I hate to admit it, after all these ceremonies and therapists, I still have this fear of death. And part of that goes back to the fact that I found it in a men's work session that I have a very young female self. She's just very afraid and very shy. She's not, there's anything particularly wrong. She wasn't really traumatized like many people were. She just didn't get the love she needed exactly the way she needed and wanted it when we were kids, which is, in some ways true for almost everybody. Other people, have more serious traumas in their life. So, a very important theoretical distinction for us is that while you may have one or more selves that were created in this kind of a moment, you also have selves that came into being or were created or came online during happy and blissful moments. And I'll give you an example. I was in Port Charles, Virginia, which is on the Chesapeake, the fourth largest meteor strike in the world. And it was family vacation, and we were all there. And I spent about 3 hours one day on an inner tube in the Chesapeake. It's like 4 feet high, but very warm and delicious. And I just started rolling, and my feet were rolling, and I really became a slug, right? And I remembered back to being at the beach club I went to every day growing up for the first 14 years of my life, which is where I learned to move into that part of who I was. That's a very positive self. Likewise, I have a Taekwondo self. I trained under a world-class master for 3 years with him, and I still practice, most weeks, at least some, and I can still do a crescent kick over my head. When I move into that part of who I am, that, either I'm in him and I'm doing the work and remembering what I remember and practicing, or I'm not. Again, a very positive self, although, I had been bullied as a kid. So I sort of went out of my way to create a whole expression of my life energy that would involve this. So we actually list a lot of different sources of potential selves, from the cellular and biological to the voices of your parents to karmic stuff to possibly angels and demons and reincarnate. And ultimately, and before we say all that stuff, we say, here's a lot of information about what people have thought, but none of it really matters. All that really matters is that you learn how to be triggered into the wrong self at the wrong time less, and that you learn to shift into the right mind at the right time more easily, and realize and are more compassionate for yourself and other people, because that's the sort of the automatic result of that.
This makes me really curious about the future emergence of selves. And I think about that in a couple different ways. Down the Gurdjieffian line, there's this idea of forming higher bodies that they talk about as if there's selves we don't quite have yet. Jordan Peterson speaks a lot about taking your future selves into account over different time scales, right? And there's a question about how real that is relative to having acquired a younger self at a younger stage and still having that with you, because there's a sort of a virtual quality to a future self.
Yeah.
There's also, I think, an idea about hybrid selves, like in the Pixar film Inside Out.
Right.
Sadness and happiness work together, and at the end they form a kind of new hybrid color that wasn't there before, which is a mixture of those two self qualities. So what's your take on the emergence of new selves?
That's a really great question. My personal point of view has always been that you can feel the future washing backwards through time. Whether you can feel selves that haven't yet emerged now, I don't see why you couldn't. But again, they have more of that, ghostly or virtual or many worlds hypothesis kind of being to them. I should say that Jim Fadiman is skeptical that new selves emerge or you can create them. Different people have different models. And we like to say we don't have a theory. We really stop after the basic observations on this horizontal plane. Anything up here or down here is spirituality, religion, and above, our pay grade. It seems to me that you can create, a new self, certainly a new ordinary self. Whether you can create a high self, let's say with, the benefits of all the plant medicine, the psychedelic renaissance, why not? But again, that's beyond our pay grade. We're just talking about, there might be a part of me that can get up every day and actually both be putting out information on rebound exercise, which is the other book I wrote last year, and this book, and, be much more productive and run a whole bunch of different rooms on Clubhouse. I'm wondering if that would really be a return to one of my very proactive selves in high school, where I was, just a very effective nerd and did a lot of homework. So I don't really know about creating new selves, but I think it's important on purpose. But I think it's important to realize that they do evolve. I mean, the first time you're, with someone who you're then become physically and sexually and emotionally bonded to, it feels like a new self might arise in that moment, especially if it's going to be a lifelong partnership. So it's a good question, and I don't know.
Okay. When you were talking about Timmy and the orange juice,
yeah,
it occurred to me that people could look at that from a couple of different angles, right? One angle is sort of top down, where we think there's a psychology there, and the psychology is plural, and one of the abstract psychological mental entities created a psychosomatic effect in the body whereby this kid can drink orange juice. The other way to look at it bottom up and say, in the modes in which the chemistry in which that body can assimilate the orange juice is operative, that kind of throws up a self, right? That the biochemistry and the behavioral mode cloaks itself in a psychological identity. So I'm curious about how you see the relationship between the mental concept of selves and the chemical, physical, and behavioral modes, and how that maybe shows up in a question like, do animals have multiple selves?
Well, to answer that one first, we absolutely think so. We actually both, I write about my cats and Jim writes about his dogs. And, I have a cat that goes from being incredibly loving and lying on your face and relaxed to being incredibly freaky. And, a pencil drops 3 houses away and he runs. Or Jim's dog, who's incredibly loving and also incredibly vicious, depending if he's triggered. I think we shouldn't overthink this. I think that in the case of Timmy, somehow his love for orange juice has, brought back or created or invoked. I don't think we have to know how it works, but we sort of know that that it does work. I mean, you think of, there's all sorts of things out there where people have powers that they're not supposed to have. And, from all the psychic stuff to, some people, Rasputin, right? They poisoned him. It didn't matter, and so I don't really know how that works. Ultimately, I'm of the mind that it is all mind and matter precipitates out of it, more of a Hindu view, and we're quantum entangled. And so that really we're, anything is possible. And on some deep level, we actually are co-creating reality. So I don't know the causal mechanisms, but I don't think they matter. I think what matters is, what you can do. And here's like another example. Herschel Walker, we talk about him in the book, great multi-sport athlete and businessman and dancer, and won a version of a cooking show on contest. When he was starting, he was fat and overweight in junior high school, and he decided he would run. He started running, and he was in a lot of pain, and the doctor said he had to stop, and his mother said, Herschel, if you want to run, you should keep running. And he describes how at night he literally created a self that learned how to deal with the pain, because that's what he needed how to do. And he constructed that self. And then later throughout his whole, athletic, being an NFL fullback and being a martial arts MMA fighter, he always could come back to that self. So I think certain very strong-willed people can forge what they need, but it's, we're not recommending that's the kind of thing you do. I would like superpowers, please, but, it's a little beyond my pay grade as well.
Okay, let's talk about the relationship between selves and language. A lot of the either integrating or getting to know and embrace yourselves has to do with various dialogical therapies that people perform. Wilber talks about 3-2-1. There's the big mind processes and these, Gestalt techniques of trying to allow these different selves to speak. And I'm curious about whether that involves something like teaching each of them to learn language, or whether the language function is separate and each of them just gets to use that language as if they're sitting in that throne temporarily. Is language separate?
That's another really good question.
Yeah.
I was in a big mind session with Diane Hamilton once. I remember what that felt like. It feels like your different selves are getting permission to come out, and the really reverent, meditative Zen, as it were, part of who I was able to come out and be present. I think some selves are pre-verbal, most probably aren't. The language thing is very tricky because it's so built into our language that almost every time you talk, you're reinforcing the notion of a single self. So I try in my writing now to throw in selves with an S. This is what I found out for myself. Or you'll see people talking about the word selves a lot, and you think that they must be referring to plural, but then you just apply the filter, and maybe they're really saying all of the different selves someone has. And then you have this whole thing about talking to yourself out loud, which, first of all, almost everyone in the world does. But people are afraid to do it because if you have more than one self, then you're mentally ill. But one of the fascinating pieces of research is that if you talk to yourselves out loud in the third person or in other than the first person, other than by I, the amygdala kind of calms down and the neocortex lights up. And people are more effective and less emotionally reactive. So if I go, Jordan, it's time we need to leave now. Okay, we've been doing this for a while. We need to get on with the day. That's going to work with better than I need to do this. What I found interesting about this is that the interpretations I read about this in mainstream media is mainly that's because you have a perspective on these different cells. You're seeing them like a third separated part. But I don't see that. I see the we lets me actually get more deeply into the part that needs to do something now. So I'm more further embodying that part of whom I am. And we're back to the Alcoholics Anonymous. When I say my name is Jordan and I'm an alcoholic and I'm being witnessed and surrounded by a group of other people who have said the same thing, that self is really present. And the language function, they're not saying my name is Jordan and part of my self system is alcoholic. That would be more accurate. But still, they are invoking the part that has the problem. So, you see a lot of dialogue stuff. Fritz Perls and the two different chairs and top dog and underdog. And, a lot of parts work starts out, coaching and even therapeutic parts work by, asking if we can talk to the part of the person who has this problem or has this issue. And so, yeah, I don't think there's any way around language. And one of the things we did was we asked people who speak different languages to come up with phrases like, I don't know what got into me, or I was besides myself, or, there's all of these phrases in English. And it turns out that in most other languages, it's pretty easy to find them except Russian, where apparently this idea makes absolutely no sense at all. And they don't even know what to tell me yet.
There are a number of philosophical communities who like to speak in terms of the individual rather than the individual.
The individual.
The individual, yeah. It's sort of associated with Gilles Deleuze, but it's used in metamodernism and the intellectual deep web community, things like that. It sort of has three implications as far as I can tell. One is intrapsychic plurality.
Okay.
Another one is that our identity is embedded in and informed by our relationships and our environment.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is that we're entering into an age in which we are using avatars and showing up differently on different apps and platforms in different spaces, and we're treated by society as different sets of data.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a way in which the plural nature of the self is uniquely appropriate to the kind of society and technology and economy that's emerging right now.
Right, exactly. This is actually very in concert with postmodernism generally. In academia, there's this whole notion of intersectionalism, where you can't really understand someone unless you basically see how all their trajectories of their life from all the different parts of their lives are crossing right now. There is some interesting stuff going on online where Facebook tries to enforce you to have a single identity, but Twitter, you can have more than one, right? It doesn't really matter. But I do think this is the way the world is moving. And certainly there's a much greater plurality of sexual identity than ever before. I've learned, with my daughter not to say anything because I always get it wrong because it's moving so fast terminologically. But I think it's very much in concert with that. And I have a friend named Max Taylor, who is an attorney, but also been a great help, and was in a community that worked with selves. And he turned me on to a guy named Vandenberg, who wrote a book called Divided Society. And there is certainly another point of view that is saying that this idea that these discrete individual selves that you think you are, really none of them are sort of you in that sense, that they're all created from the intersection of a nexus of a zillion forces in real time and with many people, and that this whole thing is an illusion. It's like the Bucky Fuller I am a verb, but even more loose than that. And I think that's, an equally valid way of looking at things. Our view is just a little bit more pragmatic and more useful because people can get the idea of shifting into the right mind at the right time. They can know that they have a part of them that if they go down the same path they always go down with the person they're with, they're about to have a bad fight. Or just like I've learned to take myself out of restaurants if I haven't been served for too long and I think they're picking on me, because that's nothing to do with me. And if I get into the righteous, total asshole part of myself, I feel terrible, even if I'm right. So I actually know that if I'm in that self and it's been triggered, I just now take myself out. I just go away. It's a much better solution than, proving I'm right and everybody feels terrible. What good is that? But that's because I know that part of me, if it stays, it wants to fight, and that's not a healthy part to let stay. I have to work with that part and heal it and, take in all the good and realize that I am important and loved and all that stuff, but not right in that moment.
When I trace my memory back and try to find some of my earliest experiences that might be describable as plural selfhood, I think of a time with some other kids. I was up in the woods. I was very young, and I thought I was going to jump off this cliff over a waterfall.
Ooh.
Run up to it, but when I got up to it, I changed my mind and headed back. And then I remembered that I wanted to do it, so I tried again. When I got up to the edge, I changed my mind and went back. And this happened a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
Something else noticed the pattern. And then I pretended to turn back and suddenly turn around quickly and jumped.
Right.
There was a negotiation there, but in hindsight, what I remember really valuing was a kind of Zen koan-like sweet spot right between the two of them. So I'm curious how much you think in terms of, integration and health and working well with multiple selves, how much is about inhabiting them and embracing them and acknowledging them and appreciating them, and how much is about getting more comfortable in a kind of in-between space between them?
So, I mean, the in-between space, and we talk a lot about establishing a grounded, centered presence from which you can do this kind of selves work better. Do you know the book Stealing Fire?
Mm-hmm.
He talks about the Navy SEALs and how the last third of their very expensive training is teaching them to work with the other SEALs. And they describe a technique called dynamic subordination. And that's sort of when, the guys are going into the dangerous house, and, one goes around the corner and he's got his back, and then the other ones go in, and then that one moves into the lead. So that's one of the metaphors for, you have to really trust the next self that needs to come up, that it's going to do the right thing, that you'll allow that most appropriate self to kind of slip in and be the one you want it to be. And that might be, it's time to, run into the cold ocean or jump over the cliff. Even the part of you doesn't want to, if you get your body in gear enough, you're going to do it. And just, so the whole way of learning to work with them is really the question, and it's going to differ for everyone. And that's why we have so many different metaphors, flocks of birds and teams and boards, board of directors. And there's a lot of different metaphors. We're just inviting people to find one that works for them. And what we find, and this is stealing from Tim Galloway, is that awareness heals. When you are aware that you have different selves, if you allow yourself to question the single self assumption, and you start looking at some of the things you do that you feel you could be better at, then it very naturally, you learn to slip the right one in. And, and other people need more extreme things. There are extreme things. There's like Odysseus pacts, right? You're going to get in a certain situation at a certain time. This is like me with the restaurant. If I get triggered by that certain thing, because I'm so good at putting up shields, no one sees me, whose fault is that? Then I leave. So you can do it that way. Or, the jazz band metaphor is a really great metaphor. They don't like talk between themselves. Who's going to take the beat right now, right? They just kind of feel into it. So that's the art. That's the life skill. Some people have called, the harmonious integration of yourselves the real skill for the second half of life.
And there's different ideas that I hear in there about how these selves can coordinate with each other better. The Gurdjieffian idea was, to some extent, that we have buffers, or we have some kind of cognitive dissonance or resistance between allowing them to touch each other, and then we might have to set up a condition that feels like an inner struggle to us, just in order to allow them to make contact with each other.
Right.
Way is to do some kind of back and forth experiential dialoguing. But another way is, like you're saying about the jazz band, where they don't necessarily have to talk about it. They just have to fall into a kind of entrainment around a shared task or project.
Right.
It makes me think about flow states and things like that. Like, what are activities that by their very nature tend to bring a lot of ourselves into the same activity together and give them a better sense of teamwork?
Yeah, I think there's two different ways we can think of flow. And one of them is that kind of harmonious integration of all of your cells in real time. And the other is that you have certain cells doing certain things that are more likely to bring you into flow state. So I'm into rebound exercise. I've mentioned that. It's a pretty easy way to move into flow when I have old rock and roll or classical music on, because I stop thinking and I'm moving, and literally all of the fluids in my body are flowing, and it's easy to just relax and be fully present without going anywhere. So that's sort of how I do it. But, I know people who paint, or there's certain types of writing that I'm doing more for fun and exploration than for, work or money. And when I'm doing that, there are times when, all of me does disappear and I'm just in the one self that's present. So maybe that's another way of defining flow, is that you're in an active, happy self and, just doing what it does best in your, zone of genius, as the phrase is going on now. But again, genius doesn't refer to finding a single super self and connecting with it. And I've got the genius self. It involves coordinating and harmonizing yourselves and letting the parts of you that are world class, getting them present and allowing them to do their thing.
I'm very intrigued by that sort of tension between the notion of a meta self, which allows all these selves to do their own thing, and the sense that some self might try to be the self. And it seems like religious history is full of this, right?
Yeah.
The early chapters of the Quran, Allah shows up and there's already a group of entities there. He says, I'm the only one. I'm going to take over.
Mm-hmm.
Right? To some degree, this is the way Jordan Peterson describes archetypal history as the tale of one complex which thinks of itself as the self becoming the supreme complex in a hierarchy of selves.
Yeah, exactly.
One way to think about how they get organized. Another one is to think about something that just emerges as the interstitial and background space of all of their mutual coordinations.
Well, we're back to the horizontal versus the vertical axis. If it helps you, Gurdjieff said you had to create the single self in order to be able to move down here. IFS says the same thing. You have to have this, but we're going. That's again, it's a different question. And looking at all the horrific history of single selfism throughout history, I mean, it's that kind of megalomaniacal desire to take over and be the only one, and it just doesn't go anywhere. And that's why you have people like the Jungian iconoclast James Hillman writing specifically about plurality of what does he call it? It's not just religious multiplicity. Hillman's got this great term for it that I'm not thinking of right now, but it's I will in a second. And he was very aware that there's a reason, pantheistic psychology, there it is, and he was very much interested in that. Interestingly, a little bit more of the history is that Carl Jung wrote his medical dissertation on the subject of his cousin's case of multiple personality. And then Jung studied with Genet, not Charcot, but Genet in Paris. And then, of course, he was Freud's great disciple until he broke. So what Jung ended up doing was basically bringing it underground with two different concepts, the archetypes and the notion of autonomous complexes. And if you read Jung on autonomous complexes, it sounds an awful lot like he's talking about selves the way we're talking about them, as viable fragments of personality that sometimes just do their own thing. And then after Jung, you get to Hillman, who is, his early books are very much like, yes, everybody, polyistic psychology, pantheistic psychology, maybe that was it. It's one of those. But later on, Hillman ended up talking about the soul's code. You have the single soul, and you have to follow that code. So we kind of view him as having regressed a little bit in his later years.
Your angry restaurant character story.
Yeah.
That kind of reflection, which seems to emerge very naturally out of the psychoactive power of just considering ourselves to be multiplicities, seems like an emergent form of wisdom. So it seems like there's a dharma of plurality, and how we hold that relative to other forms of dharma through history are interesting, because so many of them seem so focused on the notion of a self. So like I'm thinking of Ramana Maharshi's kind of self-inquiry, where you're going to absorb your attention into the sense of the I.
Right. So who am I?
From your point, from the point of view of plural selves, what does it mean to focus your attention on the I?
Well, again, I've long been a fan of Ramana Maharshi, and spent time in younger years, doing his work for a long time. I think that if you break through and have that level, for him, it's sort of an impersonal single self. That is the ultimate nature and root of reality itself, But again, that's not going to help you, get your bills paid on time and work out as much as you want to and eat the right foods and do all the things you want to do in ordinary life. So I think that in some cases, this focus on a single I can be very helpful. And in other cases, it's there's a lot of historical and other reasons for thinking it can be damaging. And again, as soon as you start going there, we feel you're into religion or spirituality and not just psychology. If I knew you well enough, I would be able to observe some of yourselves and point them out to you, even if you didn't see them all, and that's kind of just true of everybody we know. So, and I've known some high beings and some enlightened beings, and I've interviewed people, but they also are just kind of ordinary people who also have their stuff. I mean, you talk about the Dalai Lama, and the people who know him tell you that he still gets upset and unhappy and goes up and down, and, he's different selves too. Now, his overall constellation of selves may be very different, because there's this, huge, coherent, meditated bodhisattva at the core of it. but he still has to live in the ordinary world and deal with the things that come up and realize that the people in his life aren't always going to be consistent because sometimes they're in different cells. And that's really a big point. This isn't just about you and doing better. It's about realizing that you can be more compassionate to everybody in your life. So near the end of the book, we have an appendix on dissociation and describe why the whole term should be jettisoned, because it doesn't really mean anything than as a way to get money to the medical system and doctors and hospitals. And we also describe and provide a new a continuum of selves that's based on cohesion. The more cohesive you are, whether you're here in pathological selves and really messed up, or here in assumed identity, or here all the way over to a whole symphony of selves, the more cohesive you are, the more congruent, coherent, and compassionate you'll be, according to what we laid out. And coherent means that you can be understood by other people. And congruence just means that your body, that's still just one most of the time, or it's mainly one, will do what it says. And then the compassion towards the different parts of you that aren't quite as good and effective as they can be, and towards the other people in your life who are inconsistent, the compassion automatically flows all the way around. And we just think that's because this is the way people are actually built. And we've been told for so long, we're not this way, that, when someone forgets something, you assume that, they're doing it on purpose, or trying to mess you up, or how could they have forgotten? They were right there. But, you just have to look at yourself when you put down, your keys in a place you don't know where it is in your phone. The part of you that put it down wasn't paying attention, and the other part of you doesn't know where it is. It's sort of, that simple. And that's why we go back to Occam's razor. We invite people to test this idea in a lot of scenarios. When, you wake up in the morning with someone you slept with only once, and then you kind of leave and never want to see them again, you were in a different part of who you were the night before than when you wake up in the morning. There's just lots of examples throughout all of life where the inconsistency, and we talk about the very first page of the book. Have you ever had an argument with yourself? Well, who were you arguing with? And if you ever had an argument with yourself and changed your mind, whose mind changed? So the simplest explanation about what happens when we're talking with ourselves, and maybe in the information that's flowing in dreams or through the default network, is that we do have these different cells and that they are communicating, and we've just pretended it's not that way for a very long time.
What would you say to somebody who said this is absolutely the wrong way to look at things, that the sense of self is already the sort of readout of the amount of coordination and partnership among the subcells, and that's increased by magnifying that individual sense of self and by presupposing that it is responsible for all of the manifestations. It allows itself to be in a better position to coordinate them. And when it treats them as if they are others, it sort of cultivates an internal division that doesn't even allow those parts to coordinate at their optimum rate.
Yeah, that's a very cogent alternative explanation. And if the people who disagreed with us came at us like that, that will be great. But what instead you find out, and you see it in the Amazon comments, and and when I was posting, I did some early advertising on Facebook till I realized that every time I did that, I lost money in the end. People got really angry. It was like, we don't need this. It's wrong. People are messed up already. People are barely hanging on to the self of who, the part of who they are. And so, I think you can conceive of it alternatively like that. But the problem is then you never really take yourselves seriously. Our whole idea, I don't want to call it a theory because it's not, it's more a set of observations, is that until you know that yourselves are real and that each one has innate value, and that you can't get rid of it, and that sometimes they're going to have different agendas that are going to mess you up unless you find a way to work with it and heal with it, negotiate it. And until you do that, often things don't get better. So, I think there can be this sort of facade that you can just construct this super powerful single self and everybody's going to fall in line and that'll be it. But, in our experience, it doesn't work. Just like in our experience, most people we've ever known who've been part of your chief groups and communities left and weren't happy with it because their lives were awful. It's this, I think it's more the dying grasp of a single self world system that leads all the way up to, the terrible problems we're facing. And it's just, it's incorrect. It's as strange as it may seem, and wherever they might come from, and whether they're incarnational or based on your neurons or how your parents talk to each other, or where it comes from. And I also wrote a book for a shaman last year called he's known as the Shaman of Wall Street. It was called The Secrets of the Seasons. You're here for a reason. So I had to completely view it differently, and I understand that worldview where I'm here for a reason. I have a certain purpose. I can always lean into my soul's purpose at any moment. But, again, that's religious. It's spiritual. And there's part of me that, I used to be super new agey, and I'm much less, although I'm still kind of neo-pagan and believe in magic and psi and all these things. But I just don't know that it works to go, yeah, it's just the me, and the me is a little messed up, as opposed to, we get back to like psychedelic therapy and integration. Jim now feels that the most important part of integration, the keystone to integration, is knowing that you have these different selves. So that way, not only can you coordinate and harmonize them as you are regelling into your ordinary sense of being, but if there's one of them that's particularly hurt or harmed or destructive, you can kind of find that part of you and work with it and heal it. If you're keeping this thing going, well, it's really just the big me and all these little parts are these just like unimportant side effects, I don't think you can do that kind of healing.
To what degree does our plurality reflect the plurality of being, right? Like, is God singular or plural? Or I don't know if you know the philosopher Alain Badiou from France, but he's made a very interesting argument that multiplicity is prior to unity. He's working with set theory in mathematics, and when something is one, it's the oneification of a group. It's being grouped. And that means that before it was grouped into one, it was a multiplicity. So as soon as you have one, you have the grouping of a multiplicity that's implied as the prior condition. So it's take, which nicely balances thousands of years of thinking that unity is prior and multiplicity is an epiphenomenon, is that things are essentially multiple and that unity is an illusion.
Well, right. And that's why so many religious traditions, let's look at the Egyptians, or let's look at the Hmong, or let's look at the Hindus, very much have a pantheistic psychology, so that you as individuals can have the different parts of you being in touch with the different parts of the God spectrum that particular religion has. So, it's hard, right? People have been talking about unity and multiplicity, or multiplicity and unity for a very long time. I go back to thinking about the Big Bang. I took a great course called A Big History from the Teaching Company, 1-800-TEACH, and it was on big history, and the guy kept making the point that at different levels of being, from, let's say, enough matter being attracted by gravity so that a star lights up, to enough people being attracted to living together so that a city lights up, you see the same patterns. You see the same patterns all the time. So the way I've been thinking about it ever since is that you and I right now are on the extreme outside of the shock wave of the Big Bang that looks like it was a singularity, but even then we don't really know. And yet we're somehow quantum intertangled, and we're obviously talking to each other and co-regulating each other via polyvagal theory just by our voices. So, we're different, but we're connected. And I don't know that we can go much deeper than that. I do know that there's a couple of other more modern continental philosophers who we did not incorporate, and people said we should have, like Deleuze and a couple of others. So if we ever get a chance to write a second edition, we're going to have to, work with somebody who knows more about, deconstructionism and French philosophy than we do.
Here's a question. I don't even know if it makes any sense, but when a self isn't active, when it isn't, say, dominant, getting to do the moving and the speaking, where is it?
It's a great question. And, there's a lot of interesting kind of versions in movies and TV shows. If you look at Doom Patrol, which is a really fun TV show for me, one of the characters has something like 23 cells, and they have this whole world created called the Underground. And it's very interesting, and it's Crazy Jane. It's very interesting about that. I would go back and read the Billy Milligan book by Daniel Keyes, because he very much sort of describes where they are. And we have different people in the book describing it as sort of being like a boarding house. And, they're in the house somewhere, but they're just not up front. And we also talk a little bit about the default network, which, as you know, is a very hot topic these days. And, we have a couple of people talking about the fact that, it's the default network that enables you to sort of think about the future and different scenarios that happen and might happen. And, when you're not focused at all, you use 99% as much energy as when you're at 100% focus. So, maybe the selves live in the default network. We really don't know. You have older people saying that the organs, and you've seen some of the sort of Taoist Oriental medicine, the liver's smiling and, so, again, I don't really know where they are. And there are, interestingly, a few people who have co-consciousness. They are very much aware of different selves at the same time and even can go back and forth. One of the things that we have found, and this is kind of a sidelight, is that a lot of people don't like what we're doing because they have existing cognitive, emotional, or financial territory. So, for example, we found out early on that people who are diagnosed with DID, dissociative identity disorder, they think that we don't know what we're talking about, we're messing things up, and most importantly, they want to be the only ones who have different selves. That's what, they're fucked up, but they're special. We're going, no, actually, everybody, has different selves. So, it's people don't like us sometimes. The IFS people haven't liked us and left us some nasty reviews accusing me of plagiarism. And if you read my books, you know that I have no shortage of creative ideas. Yeah, we footnoted a little bit of the IFS guys and Richard Schwartz. That's what footnotes are for. But we didn't steal anything. Our book is has so much that's new and different, and that's because they. The first couple of IFS people I knew, they were like, how come you don't have us in the history? And so, well, the main history stops at 1950. He was barely born. Then, well, you should, we have 2.5 pages and we describe the system. But, you're a system that relies on the self and you're only one piece of the big picture. So they sort of have financial territory. I hate to say it. And, the cognitive territory is just general. People don't want to have to deal with the uncertainty of not having a single self, but also never having the ability to come to a single self that's going to rescue them and make everything better. And I'll give you an example. When I was younger, I thought that if I just fasted enough or did enough drugs or meditated hard enough, that I would have the single self of enlightenment. It would be like an eternal orgasm and I would never have any fears or pain. And it's like, I wanted that self really badly. And, I've let go of that now. I know that it's just, I was immature, not the way things are for hardly anybody. And even those people, they're not in those states all the time. So did I answer your question or am I rambling?
What I'm thinking about is these different forms of resistance. Like you're saying, some people have monetary and status concerns about holding sway over these topics. And
right.
I said earlier, there's a history of psychology and philosophy and monotheistic religious dominance that inclines us to think in terms of unities. And then there's some basic anxiety or concern about what happens when you allow yourself to feel into multiplicity. Did you ever see Joss Whedon's TV show, The Dollhouse?
No.
Okay, so the setting is a group of people sign themselves over for a period of a few years, and they allow themselves to have personalities installed in their bodies. Right. So I'm going to rob a bank. I need a young woman, but she has to be an expert on explosives. So they just put that in her. And one of these people, this woman who Eliza Dushku plays the main character, she starts to remember the other personalities. And you're not supposed to remember them. You get wiped every time. And then it turns out that this happened to one of them before. He's known as Alpha, and all of his personalities came back online. Mm-hmm. And broke out, and he's out there somewhere, and he's sort of the villain of the series. And the villainous quality is related to this really visceral sense of uncertainty about what it would be like to be a person who felt in all those directions simultaneously and had no sense of stable, organized self. So right. It seems like there's a really basic part of us that feels very uncomfortable about the move we would have to make and what we would feel if we took that plurality seriously.
Well, but here's the opposite of that. And I'm going to just read a little passage from the book from my friend Christina Lazar.
Please.
Visual artist Christina Lazar once shared the following reflection with Jordan. When I was younger, even in middle and high school, I knew there were a lot of people in there, a lot of different personalities that came out at different times. I would always think, This isn't cool. I'm disjointed and unfocused. I have to pick just one. So I deem some of them bad or good, pass a lot of judgment on which one I should be, and even practice squelching some of my inner people more than others. I felt that way until fairly recently. But as part of learning to be okay with myself, I realized I am all of those inner people. I learned to recognize each of my personalities as their own person and to value what they could offer and give me as a whole. Now it's okay for me to be with myself. Instead of trying to squelch out or get rid of certain ones, I honor them all for who they are and what they have to say to me. I love whiskey, art, science, sales, working out, fashion, and jewelry, and I love to make things and teach. All of these things and so much more are me. One of these things without the rest is not me. So I've been learning, working with, and sitting with each of them to see how they fit into the multifaceted overall totality of who I am. What a relief. Now I don't have to stress myself out anymore that I'm a bad person for not picking one thing and sticking it to my whole life. Now they can all talk to each other, and they have even become a kind of counsel for me to utilize. One more paragraph. Depending on the situation, I have everybody sit and listen to just the one voice that is talking. I have been doing a lot of healing of my past traumas, and the personality that was most affected had a lot to say about what occurred at that time in my life. I have everybody else just sit there and listen to that one voice and offer either words of comfort and healing or just acceptance. So we've found quite a lot of people who are giving themselves permission to be the different parts of who they are, including doing things like reclaiming younger selves that were really creative, even if it's like finger painting or like to sing. I mean, I sing in the shower and sing out loud because I've always sung, and sometimes I get embarrassed, but then it's like, I don't need to be embarrassed. That's just part of who I am. So, I do see that there is a very strong fear of not having that single self, and that is where a lot of resistance comes from. And that's why all of these systems, especially the therapeutic ones, seem to have a single self in the middle of it. But, I would say if that's the issue, then just recontextualize a single self as the ground of being, which is not all really that different than the Hindus with a single self in the way Ramana wants it, right? There's a single everything that you are a part of, and you are this part coming into fruition in real time, right here and now. But that part of you has different parts. So I don't know if that helps.
How does gender play into this? Because there's a sort of story whereby, male brains have more myelinated sheathing around the neurons, and they're a little bit more tunnel vision, a little bit more mission focused, and female brains spread information around a little bit more. Is there a tendency for this kind of pluralism to be more acceptable to women or not?
Well, I've certainly seen more women. Well, no, I don't think so. I don't think there's that big a difference. And I think I mentioned earlier, I know I have at least one female self. I think that, once you open up to the possibility that some of your selves can be different gendered or non-gendered or, any of the modern, ways of looking at it, that kind of relaxes that too. We would need data. We would need to have, 1,000 people read the book and say if they liked it or not. But I don't see that much of a difference in men and women because, some of the people who've gotten the most value, and I mentioned this earlier, are old colleagues of Jim, people who are professors and therapists and, well-known people. And they're getting it too. So I would say men would have more resistance, right? I mean, generally speaking, even in this kind of the vertical dimensions, like the single arrow going up is the male and the going down and dissolving is it would be more feminine, more flowing. But I don't know. Again, that's a great question.
There's thinking in terms of things like integral theory and developmental models that apply to society as well as individuals. There's this notion of a traditionalist mythic membership phase of kingdoms and organization and belief structures that correspond to that. And, in our culture, we look back at Judeo-Christian and their Islamic analogs, and we think in terms of this monotheism that came out of one part of the world as if it was the normal example of the great religious traditions. Mm-hmm. And then maybe there's also Hinduism or something like that. But I think when you survey the world and history more richly, it seems like the polytheistic versions of even the great mythic membership religions were more likely to be pluralistic. And it might be that the religions that came out of this one area were contracted or pathologized in some way. People have made this argument that the Middle Eastern desert versions were peculiarly contracted into this unity.
Right. Well,
do you think that if let's say if modernity had arisen out of Hinduism rather than out of Christianity, that we would be further ahead in embracing ourselves as plural beings?
Well, that's a great question, and obviously could be the basis for a TV series, right? Yeah, what happened with Judeo-Christianity? The children of Abraham, tradition does seem to be all about that single focus. I mean, we talk about the fact that it doesn't say, it says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." It doesn't say there are no other gods. And then you have that whole thing about Raphael Patai and the Hebrew goddess, and the fact that the areas that the ancient Canaanites and the Jews conquered, they had a very much a polytheistic psychology and believed in different goddesses and gods. But all that was, suppressed. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you could make the argument that the contraction that has been, bounded by religion and that has come down through both capitalism and, the way we set things up in democratic states, and that kind of unitary ziggurat pyramid has done a lot of harm. We're back to Graham Nash. Too many people have died in the name of Christ for anyone to heed the call.
I'm curious about like the modular nature of the brain and its relationship to selves. People like Julian Jaynes made this argument years ago that our ancestors had a far less integrated left-right brain situation. So they experienced it as a communication of two different realities. And lately, Ian McGilchrist has sort of been repopularizing left-right brain modalities. But it's intriguing that if you cut that corpus callosum for some reason, now the brain starts to behave much more overtly like those are two selves, right, when they were very integrated. So, to what degree are these selves nested in parts of the brain, and to what degree are they exaggerated by problems that inhibit communication between those regions of the brain?
Oh, that's another great question. I mean, I certainly think that that people can have pathologically incohesive cell systems because of organic brain problems. So we actually spend 4, 5, 10 pages in the book going through the right brain, left brain people, Gazagana, and I mean, there's 3 or 4 of them. And, we have a whole kind of thing on neuroscientists coming all the way at the end to the Gödel Escher Bach guy, Doug Hofstetter, who has pages after pages talking about his different selves coming in and arguing with each other and going around. I mean, you read him, he's hysterical. So, again, that's sort of the brain anatomy or the body anatomy. We're back to the enteric, system. There's up to 100 million neurons in the gut and the enteric system, although there's 20 times as many in the brain still. But, there is a gut in the brain. There are different parts of the body that seem to have their own awarenesses. And, I think this is interesting. But again, I go back to the part of, all this is in the book, and we give you our best shot at, I read everything I could find in English and even translated some things and brought it all together in one place. So in a lot of ways, the whole point of the book is just a tour de force so that you can look at what Sperry had to say about this, and you can look at what Marvin Minsky had to say about this, and you can look at what, exactly what Gurdjieff had to say about this, or James Hillman. But in the end, again, I don't think we have to know where ourselves come from to pragmatically recognize that they're real and to learn to harmonize with them. And that can be its own sort of path to, bypassing the work. It's like, I've got to understand it before I'm going to let it be real. It's like, yeah, well, we have a lot of different ways where they come from, and some of them are spiritual ideas, reincarnation, other cells, angel cells, any of that could be real. We just don't know, but none of that affects the reality that everybody seems to have a constellation of selves and benefits when they're more harmonious.
We touched on the idea that a plural notion of the self might be appropriate for the kind of society that we're in now and is emerging. And
right.
The society we have now is really informed by evolutionary and neo-Darwinist theories. And so there's this sense that, the Richard Dawkins idea that where you thought you were an individual agent participating in evolution, actually it was all of the different genetic patterns that are doing the evolving. You're not in the genetic competition. You're just a vehicle for it.
Right.
Do you think genes have selfhood?
Oh, do I think, no. Well, that's sort of a personal question. I mean, I do believe that ultimately, if there's anything like a real God on this planet, it's the DNA molecule. So So I don't know if different DNA molecules have, I mean, we're back to this notion of prehension goes all the way down to the smallest quark and that sort of thing. And, it's a good question, but again, I don't know. I'm
Yeah, I
sorry.
don't expect you to have answers to all these. They're just where I'm curious.
Well, I don't have answers. I'm just a writer.
In the Ken Wilber sense,
Right.
do different lines of intelligence constitute different selves?
No, I would say it's that different selves are along different lines of intelligence to different degrees.
Okay.
So, some of my selves are very good with very tight mechanical things and little screws. But there's a whole bunch of me that if I'm not really present, my dad apparently got the lowest ever recorded score on the Navy's mechanical ability test before he way back when. And I can very much be like that if I'm not present. But there's a part of me that can be like hyper precise. So, and I also think that's true with things like being in a room in Clubhouse. There's parts of me that are getting better and better to realize when it's appropriate and not appropriate to talk about this book. If you just go in and you're completely blowing it, you're authentic. So this is not, nobody cares, and you turn people off, right? And so then I just kind of focus on me and participating. But I had to learn that, it's not always appropriate to be with this sort of a person, this part of who I am. So and parts of me are much better at dealing with people and even offering spiritual support and, really being in a high love state. And other parts of me just aren't good at that at all.
Shadow material. Does our shadow consist of our other non-integrated selves, or do selves have shadows?
Oh, I think maybe both. I think that, with shadow, the first thing is, the notion of shadow as sort of the Jungian archetype and a level of transhuman, difficulty that you have to deal with. Dark night of the soul, full existential crisis, like the shadow in that sense. Another sense is just that some of yourselves are literally always kept in shadow, or almost always chained away, or almost always kept in the dark. And that's because you think they're going to do things that are bad. But usually when you work with those cells and you let them out, they're so grateful for getting to come out and to hang out that they behave pretty well and they seem to be able to evolve. But sure, some of those cells are difficult. Some of them will trick you and they'll say, well, just do this for this long. I guess it'd be the classic, someone who says, I'm just going to have the one drink. And, before you know it, they've had 15 drinks, right? Does the part that agrees to do it and take it, is that its shadow and it knows what it's about to set up? I think maybe.
Yeah, that makes me really curious. Like, is that a self who has an addiction, or is the addiction a self?
No, I don't think the addiction is a self. I think that it's a self that has an addiction. I think that there may be an archetypal addictive energy that runs in family lines and is genetically mediated, but it will, if that's the archetype for Jung, then the autonomous complex would be the way it was fleshed out and the different parts of who you are in real time. And, you grew up in college and you always drank, or, whatever it was, you saw it in your house a lot, or, I think then it sort of takes over, or it informs and can mess with you.
There's a lot of different ways to think about how groups of human beings should be politically organized, right? There's a great story historically about, hey, we moved from authoritarianism to democracy because it's both more fair and smarter. You can't really figure things out if just one guy makes all the decisions. Everybody has to put some intelligence into the decision. But then is 51% enough? Should we be doing ranked choice voting? There's all these different ways of organizing ourselves collectively. We talked a little bit about the way a jazz band comes together around the piece of music that they're collectively improvising. But there's also a question about how a collective should compile its inputs in order to reach a collective decision. So when you think about selves, is it temporary autocracy? Is it democracy? If I had the ability, how should I comport myself relative to myself so that we could collectively make the best decision for all of us?
So this brings up in mind for me the notion of direct democracy, which I know Jim Rutt has written about a couple of times. I helped him out a little with that. And under that notion, you would basically be able to give your proxy for different areas of voting to different people who you trusted. And so you could kind of separate out the part of you that's a serious environmentalist from the part of you that has, budgetary concerns, to the part of you that, wants a smaller military or a larger military. So I think that's one way we could actually use modern technology to bring ourselves into alignment with the political process. And the great thing about direct democracy and the way Jim has written about it, Jim Rutt, is that you could do it legally right now. You wouldn't have to change anything. You wouldn't have to have a constitutional convention. You wouldn't have to change anything. And we could literally be running the whole country by direct democracy in less than 10 years and have many better decisions being made.
That's interesting. I've had discussions with Jim a few times about direct democracy and liquid democracy. It's very intriguing to think about what a system, like whether you get better results out of a system where the interpersonal and the intrapersonal approaches parallel each other.
Yeah, you would think you would. Jim's going to have us on his show, Jim and I on his show in about a month, so we're looking forward to that.
Oh, terrific. Now there's, I guess we're coming to the end of it now. These have been terrific things. There's one thing that's like stuck in my mind from a section of the book where you go through different pop culture examples of multiple selfhood.
Bowie, Beyonce.
It's Fight Club. This is just an absolutely nerdish thing, but you say Fight Club starring Brad Pitt and Jared Leto. And I was like, Jared Leto?
Did we get it wrong?
Brad Pitt and Edward Norton, who's like a bigger star and is the person who has the multiple psyche. Whereas Jared Leto is sort of a minor character.
We just screwed up. There's mistakes in the book. You go through a book like this. It took us 5 years to write, and Jim had been working on it for many years before. He gave me a bunch of boxes and 8 outlines, and it took 5 years to write. And at the end of the day, like there's a page early on where the word "that" is twice in a row. I can't tell you the number of people, me, Jim, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and then the one editor and then the second editor and the final, and yet stuff falls through. So you're right. I'll put that in my list of version 2.0. My dream is that we haven't had any national reviews. We had our best week ever last week because of the conversation with Sam Harris. But, we would like a review in the New York Times or the Washington Post, or, we're angling for an article in the Atlantic. And it's like, and I think this is because this is literally a new paradigm. It's the equivalent to a Copernican level shift. When they still had the Earth at the center, they had all this astronomical data that wasn't working. So they created these epicycles that kind of made sense in this really convoluted way. Once they put the sun in the center, everything made sense. We kind of feel this is similar. Once you put that we all healthy people have a number of cells into the center of psychology, then a lot of contortions. And like I said in Clubhouse, so much about single self and one self and authentic self and true self and imposter syndrome. And we have a way for looking at all of that and making sense of it that's based on observation and that doesn't require you, although it doesn't forbid you from seeking the single self or the zero self. And so that's kind of where we are on this.
I really like your clarity on how important the basic psychoactive effect of getting this frame is the main thing. And there's lots of different ways to do it. And there's lots of different ways that can go forward. But fundamentally, taking seriously that possibility and starting to explore and think for yourself in a number of different directions about what that would mean for how we operate ourselves and how we operate society and how we look at every facet of civilization. I think that's really important, and I like how steady and clear you are on that.
Well, one of the reasons Jim brought me in, and it was interesting early on, because first I was just going to get a with credit, because, I'm a writer, and then he came back and said, no, I want you to be a full partner in this project because you'll be around longer than I will probably, and I want you to keep up this work. And then I was going to say, okay, but, you get more of the long-term profits. And then I came back to him that night and said, if this book should ever make any money, no, we have to split it evenly or else it's not really a partnership. So it was a beautiful thing. I mean, Jim and I were very close personally to begin with, but looking at how close we are and how close our families are, they would have never become this close if we weren't going to eventually write this book. This is another one of those washing backwards through time. And for me, working with Jim for, on a daily basis and having so much of his attention and watching the way he reframes things and learning so many ways of, being better and not fighting with people. And, it's just been such a great pleasure. But the other part is that he came to trust my writing because he's an alpha writer and has written books and teaches writing. But by the end, Jim was realizing that, I have this ability to go through sentences and not find all the mistakes, unfortunately, but, to make things better, and having him trust me, and also letting me bring the history around Charcot and Genet and Freud, that's all mine. He had written a bunch of textbooks before, focused on this, but had never really put it together. And this whole framework of dissociation and the new extended continuum, I've come up with a lot of this stuff. So it's really very gratifying to feel that, together we have what in law they would call we have a 50% undivided interest in the whole. We're each half responsible for this coming out. And, ultimately you can see this as being very much in alignment with his work on psychedelics, because it's in part about creativity. It's a lot about creativity. And plus this whole piece about you're a better integration coach or by yourself if you have a basic psychological framework that's actually in accord with the way reality is constructed. So we know the single self assumption is pervasive, and that in nearly every self-help and spiritual group, there's going to be some version of the highs and all that. And we're going, but just for a while, just pretend, do the Duncan, do the thought experiment. Go ahead and, put your camel nose under the tent flap and look around and look at your life as a life that's actually constituted of a variety of healthy selves. And the more they communicate and the more they're real, and the more you learn to work with them, the happier and healthier and more effective you and everyone in your life is going to be. So it's a very simple, it's a very simple offer. It's other than, getting the book, which, you really only need the title to get it. So we're very excited. We were a little disappointed that things started a little slower in the pandemic than we wanted, but it's nice to see things picking up. It's very gratifying.
When I think about Freud and Jung and people like that, well, I think a lot about, I always really liked Wilhelm Reich as a provocateur of ideas.
Oh, yeah.
Somewhere between, Freud and Fritz Perls in this zone. But one of the things he was very interested in, as I'm sure you know, is the relationship between what a healthy body that can move energetically and dynamically looks like compared to one that's armored and locked down,
right?
Fixed character, right? So there's a sense of artificially imposed unity. And in order to overcome that, the parts of your body, like to be orgasmic in the Reichian sense,
right,
all parts of your body need to be able to move somewhat independently of each other to allow those motions and those energies to pass through you. And that can't happen if they're all trying to hold one fixed shape. So it sounds to me like what you're saying about plurality is a little bit like that at the level of the psyche, which is they're not fundamentally separated, but unless they have the wiggle room to move,
yeah, that's very nice,
then they won't be able to operate as a complex system moving energy through themselves.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Reich. I even have an Oregon blanket that if I put it on you, you'd go, wow, that's really weird. And, I got to read character analysis, and, I've often held Reich as being one of two Freud's most important disciples with Jung, but Reich as the sort of the father of all modern body work. And, and as you indicated, for Reich, if you're armored, you can't actually have a full orgasm because your body can't really move, whether it's blocked, wherever it's blocked, in your hips, your jaw, or whatever. So, I wonder what he would have thought about this idea. I mean, he was a big opponent of fascism, as you probably know, and didn't like unitary things. But of course, he, ended up coming to not such a good end, even though he was a complete genius.
Yeah, there's something there that development and health have in common that intrigues me, right? Like if the Reichian notion of being able to separate into a functional collective is health, then in the same sense, I want to say the Wilberian notion, but like say the Habermasian notion, that if you're familiar with it, that one of the things modernity brought that made it more complex than tradition was that it separated the value spheres. It said, right, hey, politics and our religion and our art don't all have to be the same thing. We can have more than one book. Now, they're not fundamentally absolutely separated, but we've teased them apart a little so they have more space to move.
So this is the dignity and the dangers of modernity, right? And the danger here is the whole flatland thing where everything on the middle is completely flattened, and the fact that you don't even have one self, no more multiple selves, all of that. All we've got is behavior that can be measured. And I know you don't believe in that, and I don't believe in that. The interior landscapes are at least half of everything, right? We sort of know that. So modernity did its job, and now it's also brought us to the point where, the biosphere might not be viable. So we got to figure something else out.
I guess that's why we need there has to be something like a shamanic polytheistic future, which is interesting because it's simultaneously futuristic and archaic in the same move.
And what there's some of that stuff happening. Like if you know Alberto Villoldo's work, he's a shaman, and I haven't met him, but I like his videos. And he did one of these where he did a breathwork thing that was the same, and he was citing it as polyvagal theory, right? It's a 1-1-2-1 or 3-3-6-3. Breathe in for 3, hold in for 3, breathe out for 6, hold out for 3. And that, according to, polyvagal theory, is bringing the whole body into better alignment. We know the autonomic nervous system has 5 gears, not 3. And so it's shamanism, but it's also very scientific at the same time. So I like that very much. Whether we're going to figure out anything about the hard problem of consciousness and how reality is actually co-created so that we can stop, the ecocide from happening, it's anybody's guess, right? But it seems like we should at least start in that direction.
Yeah. And, we'll work that out in our next talk.
All right.
Thanks very much, Jordan. This has been fantastic. And I
really enjoyed it. I'm in a really gregarious space. I sort of want to keep going, but I know it makes sense to end it. And I love your questions. They're very thoughtful. There was about 6 where I went, I don't know. But, that's one of the things I've learned. And I've also seen from Jim is we'll go either, well, it's in the book in a lot of detail, or I don't know, or that's not really what we're focusing on. We're just focusing on if we all really have selves. Don't you want to know that? Don't you want to learn how to love them all up into the whole, as our friend Kentless Stryker puts it? Don't you want there to be more communication between them so that awareness heals? Don't you want to be that really cool jazz band where you move from part to part? Don't you want to be like the Navy SEALs when you have to, and the flock of birds that knows where to turn? So, look at the metaphors, look at the models. There's a lot of different ways in the book that people, have learned to work with this, but it's not a self-help book. It's important. Although we did write a self-help article for Ben Greenfield about performance and longevity. So the book is more like a guide or a gazetteer to a different land that you don't know you're living in, but you're actually living in it. And once you start seeing all these examples of how it's real, and in so many books and novels and 19th century, it's in so many places that you go, well, maybe it's really part of my life too, and these guys aren't just crazy and hallucinating all this and doing the devil's work.
Yeah, it seems like it's been right under our noses the whole time.
Well, and so that's why Jim started back way long ago, looking, why are people inconsistent? Why am I so inconsistent? Why? And I had a friend, a great spiritual and psychedelics mentor named Bill Eichmann. And when I was in my early 20s and visiting him on this pilgrimage, I said something like, yeah, I'm going to wake up every day at 6:30 and meditate for half an hour. And he just looked at me and he said, the part of you that wakes up is not the part that's making this vow. It's not going to happen. And it's like things that are that simple, or the fact that when you're indecisive, sometimes that's because you really have 2 different selves that are not in agreement, and you're real, am I going to jump off the cliff or am I going to just turn around? There were really 2 parts of you that were not in agreement. So that's a very simple way of describing what's going on. Also, when you're talking to yourselves out loud and in so many situations. So, we're going for, principle of parsimony is like, we're down with that. That's what we think we're actually doing. We had this in America till 1910. Social selves were part of William James' description of the way it was. And then we completely pushed the idea of multiplicity underground, made it pathological, and only brought it back in systems generally that were for therapy and for working with people who had, real problems. But for everybody else, for the majority of, people who have a constellation of healthy selves, once you get the idea that that's what's really going on, you probably kind of already knew this. And here on the West Coast and, all our friends and, everyone I know already seems to get this. But I know that once you let it in on a deeper level and let it begin to affect your behaviors, you'll be very glad that you did learn to, how to shift into the right mind at the right time. It's really, it's easy, it's inexpensive, and it will make your life better.